Hi, everybody. So, picking up on last week's lecture where we were talking about environmental stressors, and we talked about social networks being very positive for health. Can you think of any social networks that might be negative for health? I mean, are social networks always a great thing, or is it contextual? Does it depend on, what type of network you're in, who's in the network, what you're doing? So, Haruna.
Wouldn't bureaucracy be a social network?
Bureaucracy? Yeah, that can be a kind of a stultifying social network. What other kind of networks might not be so good for the spirit or behavior or health? What's your name? Being in a gang. So that might lead you into some pretty tricky situations that aren't so safe or helpful. Other kinds of networks. Prison systems. Yeah. You can think of others. We saw those networks on obesity. So if in your network people are getting heavier, there's a tendency you're going to get heavier. So there are some situations where social networks per se are not going to be the ticket in terms of good health. So we want to go over some of issues like that. But first I want to go through the material today. And last Tuesday we were talking about responding to the environment, how people respond to environmental stressors like temperature, extreme heat, residential relocation, work overload, overtime, natural and technological disasters. So there are a lot of stressors that put strain on our immune systems and on our physiology. So we're talking about those kind of responses last Thursday. Today, we're talking about how people respond to environmental design and how that affects social interaction. So that's a different kind of response to the environment. And we can look at different levels of environmental design. So we've got facilities design, like a building. This classroom is a facility. Neighborhood design, which is more of a meso or intermediate scale. And then urban design or urban planning, where you have the layout and the plan for a whole community. So how does design at these different levels affect our social behavior, our social interactions? Now, some of these slides, again, will be a bit of a review. We'll pick up on some things we talked about in earlier lectures. We talked about environmental determinism, which is the philosophy or the assumption that environments have direct and invariant relationships on us. So we get exposed to a germ, we get sick. That's the germ theory. Or you live close to people in a residential setting, you become friends. That's proximity determines friendship. And we have that study at MIT by Festinger and his colleagues, and we have Winston Churchill emphasizing that point there. And going back to my experience as a college student at the University of Chicago, my first dorm was this high-rise here called Pierce Tower. And it was quite different than some dorms I lived in later, which is this one here, Burton Judson Courts, which was more of a low-rise Gothic kind of environment, really old-style dining rooms and nice courtyards. And I have to say that in this environment here, when you read that paper by Holohan about what it's like to live in high-rise dormitories, that was it for me. It was a very crazy place. We had a lot of noise at all hours of the night. Sometimes we would roll the piano into the elevator and get a washtub bass and somebody on the guitar, and we'd go up and down at 3 in the morning playing music, and the door would open, and people would say, "Oh, who's making all that noise?" And the door would close, we'd be on to the next floor. And even crazier, some people, when they were in various states of inebriation, would actually go out that window and walk around the outside window and come in the other side. They could actually do this. And once in a while, people fell, and that wasn't so good. But it was a very, active, noisy, very social dormitory. When I moved into this place, it was more subdued, not as much noise, a little bit more laid-back kind of environment. So the question is, do these dormitory structures really have deterministic effects on us? And one of the themes that comes out a lot in this course is that the physical and the social environment are highly interdependent. What goes on in the physical realm often affects the social realm. We see that in the study by Appleyard today on traffic volume going through a neighborhood in San Francisco and how that affects people's neighboring patterns, for example. We see that in the Holohan study in terms of the number of stories that a college dormitory has at the University of Texas and how students are feeling about dorm life, whether they're living on the top floors or the bottom floors. So the question is, are there these deterministic effects of the physical environment on social behavior? So we'll see some examples of where that comes out. So this is the study by Holohan, and it was done at the University of Texas with 110 freshmen. They wanted freshmen because they didn't want students that had had a lot of choice in living in kind of their preferred dorms. They wanted people that were assigned to the high rises, the low rises, and then to see what happened. Can anybody summarize just quickly what the key findings of that study were? Yes. Your name again. Rochelle. Yes, so the lower floors, if you were living on the lower floors, when students filled out these questionnaires on their evaluations of residential life and the social climate scales that we talked about, Rudy Moose developed, and we'll go over that again today, they were more positive if they're on the lower floors than on the higher floors. What about women and men students? Any differences there? Yes. Leslie. Yeah, generally the females were reacting more positively to the social opportunities of the dorm, to the relationship opportunities and personal development that the dorm afforded compared to the males. So that was another trend that they found. What about the differences between the high-rise, 13-story dormitories, like I was living in that dorm in Chicago, versus the low-rise dorms, which might have had 3 or 4 stories? Anybody remember what happened there? Yes, your name. Dave. Again, the people living in those high-rise dorms, less positive college experience or residential experience. So these are some of the dimensions that they asked students about on the University Residence Environmental Survey. And one dimension is about how social relationships get established among members of a particular residence hall. Does that residence hall provide for your personal development and encourage it? Remember, we talked about smaller behavior settings sort of cultivating or enhancing people's personal development in terms of leadership style. So depending on the size of the facility, you can have very different outcomes in terms of development. And also, does the organization emphasize maintenance, staying static, or does it emphasize change? And there are a lot of companies in our industrial world that are very focused on sort of maintenance. Some of the blue chip utility stocks that are on Wall Street are all about sort of maintaining that sort of blue chip constancy and reliability, whereas other companies are very much into sort of capturing the moment and current trends, whether that be Google or Facebook. So their environments reflect that emphasis on change. They're very flexible environments, and they have a different feel or ambiance or social climate, we would say, than companies that have more rigid kinds of work environments. So these are some of the social climate dimensions that were affected by the physical features of the residence halls. Now, when we start talking about social climate, we need to go back to this exemplar of a dysfunctional environment, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, where 33 11-story buildings were constructed on this 57-acre site in St. Louis, near North Side. And originally, the Pruitt buildings were going to be for African-American residents, and the Igoe complex was going to be for white residents, and they were named after, like Wendell Pruitt was an African-American World War II pilot, and Igoe was a U.S. congressman. But when segregation was ruled unconstitutional, they merged the racial composition of those buildings. And a lot of people at that time felt uncomfortable with that, but more than that, the structure of those buildings really discouraged what has been called defensible space, people feeling like they have a kind of security or defensibility of their environment. One of the things that happened is because revenues were very tight during the time these were built, it was 1951 to 1956, a lot of amenities from those buildings were cut out. So rather than having the elevators stop at every floor, they stopped on the 4th floor, the 7th floor, the 10th floor. They had these skip-stop elevators. And they thought that would be more efficient. Plus, they had these sort of public areas, internal public areas outside the elevator where you had different apartments opening onto them. But what this did is it brought a lot of different strangers to each floor who didn't really live on that floor. So you had less recognizability of the residents at each floor. It made it a more kind of unpredictable environment, if you will. And a lot of the crime that happened in those buildings were in these interior spaces near the elevators where you have people getting off from a lot of different floors. They don't know who's who. And so that defensible space factor was very low in those buildings, and you have a lot of graffiti, you have a lot of vandalism. And the way these buildings are sited to the street, there's very little opportunity of the residents knowing if someone comes in along here to this entry point, do they belong to this building, that building? There were close to 3,000 residential apartments in Pruitt-Igoe. So you wanted to give people kind of that transition space when we talk about intimacy gradients going from very public to semi-public, semi-private to private apartments. You want to give people that transition so they can recognize who belongs, who doesn't. Pruitt-Igoe was pretty bad on those different dimensions. Now we're going to show you a film that was developed around the time Pruitt-Igoe was being constructed and after it was constructed in the 1950s. As you know, in 1972, that whole project had to be demolished. It was so dysfunctional, no one would live there, and there was so much crime, so much vandalism that people just checked out, and the city had to demolish the whole thing. So they wasted millions of dollars on that project, even though initially it was heralded as a great architectural solution to low-income housing.
These developments are run by the St. Louis Housing Authority. This is a far cry from the crowded, collapsing tenements that many of these people have known. Here in bright new buildings with spacious grounds, they can live.
It was a very beautiful place, like a big hotel resort, I'd say.
It was like an oasis in the desert. All this newness. I never thought I would live in that kind of a surrounding.
What happened?
Well, one day we woke up and it was all gone.
We pulled up with the moving van. I knew at that point that it was hell on earth.
Pruitt-Igoe looks like a battleground. Vandalism and neglect have left fear among the remaining occupants.
In the middle 50s, St. Louis thought it had solved its low-cost housing needs, but instead a monster was created.
The experiment had gone terribly awry. It was just uncontrollable.
Pruitt-Igoe is such a symbol that we tend to forget that it is no different than the city that surrounded it. What happened to St. Louis was tragic, but that's simply not how we've told the story.
Pruitt-Igoe was always fighting against this terrible riptide of destruction in the midst of an economy that was dying.
The strong, tightly knit communities and families in which I grew up had begun to shatter, and it wasn't there. And it was one of the most tragic things I've seen.
It seemed to me that we were being penalized for being poor. That caused so much anger.
Persons that don't have a decent place to stay are willing to take these kinds of chances. Where we live, we're taking chances.
This is it. This is out of control, and we are no longer going to put up with it. We're not going to tolerate this anymore.
I said, as tenants, we've got to draw a line and say no more. No more.
The destruction of Pruitt-Igoe was heralded as the end of modernist architecture by some architectural critics. And the architect who developed the plans for Pruitt-Igoe was the same architect who designed the World Trade Center in New York. And he was very much influenced by the high-density design philosophy of Corbusier, Le Corbusier in France. And next week, when we start talking about urban design in more detail, we'll see what those sort of principles were of modernist architecture. But that kind of shows you what was happening at Pruitt-Igoe and what did in that whole investment and that whole project. Yeah, your name?
Kevin.
Kevin.
Do you think the demolition of the building would have happened if it was built in a different location with a different culture in a different area?
That's a good question. I think one of the observations of Pruitt-Igoe is that it was built in an area that was already somewhat stigmatized in St. Louis as being poor and being dangerous. And also you had the flight away from the city. There were a lot of people that didn't want to live in the downtown core, and Pruitt-Igoe was intended to try to bring people back to the central city, just like in New York In Manhattan, you had these really large public housing authority apartment complexes, multi-story. But St. Louis was a different kind of environment, and people were less keen to live in the center of the city. So when you site these kind of buildings in places that already have some things going against them, some cards stacked against them, they're less likely to be successful. So that's a good point. Now, some of the research that came out of Pruitt-Igoe by people interested in environment behavior emphasized the design features of those structures that made it difficult to establish defensible space or bringing the environment under occupants' control of it, the feeling that they have some control over what goes on in that environment. And one of the major proponents of defensible space was Oscar Newman, an urban sociologist. This is his book on defensible space. And these are some examples of the projects that he studied in New York and in other cities. These are from New York, the Tilden buildings, these low-rise Brownville houses and the Van Dyke buildings here. And then a development called Brooklyn, which is more low-rise. And then this Van Dyke, these kind of buildings here, where you see that same kind of pattern as Pruitt-Igoe. You have these geometrically arranged megastructures, but it's very hard for people to establish any kind of secondary territory in here or transition between public street and private apartments. It's a kind of a no man's land. And that's one of the problems with these low defensible space environments. Now, what Newman found is that if you compared the buildings that had 6 or less stories with those that were greater than 6 stories, and these buildings here have 14 stories, and then you cross that variable with project size, number of residential units per building, less than 1,000 or greater than 1,000 apartments, what happens is this mean of 67 here, in terms of the number of cases of crime, is highest where you have the high-story buildings and the very dense large number of apartment residences. So you get that jump in crime there, number of crimes per 1,000 residents, when you combine the height of the building and the density of the building. So that was a key finding from his research. Now, he found some other things that were pretty interesting. When he plotted the building height in the number of floors, and these are height brackets here, different categories of buildings with 2 stories, 4 stories, 6, 8, he found this linear relationship between robberies per 1,000 families and building height, number of stories. So this looks like environmental determinism, right? The more you go up in height, the more robberies. So there's something about that density and height that's breaking down the social fabric, where people can't recognize each other, they don't care about each other as individuals, and it's more of a jungle almost. Another thing that Newman found is that when you broke down and disaggregated where the crime happened, in the 3-story buildings, the mid-rise 6 to 7-story or 13 to 30-story buildings, certainly in these categories here, inside the apartments and on the outside grounds, you had somewhat of a jump, higher numbers for the higher-rise buildings. But where you really see the jump is in the interior public spaces. And these are those unprotected spaces around the elevators where people really didn't recognize each other, and it was kind of a very low defensible kind of situation. And that's where you get the greatest increase because of the height of the building or the number of stories. So that was a pretty interesting finding that he came up with. And in general, he concluded that there are certain factors that enhance defensible space. So one is to provide clear territorial definition of space, which is to say, give people those intimacy gradients that are clearly visible between the public to the semi-public to the private. Don't go immediately from the public to the private. Like in Engineering Plaza, the tall engineering building, the original engineering building, you have a public plaza out there, and then you go into an elevator and you go right up to where the offices are. There's no lobby, there's no transition between the plaza and some kind of entry into that engineering building here on our campus. So that's what he means by sort of breaking out that transition between public to private and defining the territory. Remember, we talked about territoriality and personal space and how you define territories, whether it's a dorm room or some other kind of environment, by personalizing it, by putting up evidence of group identity and things like that. Positioning windows so that residents can survey interior and exterior public spaces. Newman was really big on surveillance. If people can look out their window and know who belongs and who doesn't belong, that puts eyes on the street, in a sense, so that it's less likely that somebody's going to be there and sort of be unrecognized as not belonging and therefore be able to commit some kind of a crime that, if they were recognized, wouldn't have happened. Adopt building forms that avoid perceived stigma and vulnerability. And there are certain building forms that we see repeating in the Newman Defensible Space Research, Pruitt-Igoe, Cabrini Green in Chicago, which was another dysfunctional residential complex, where you have these megastructure, high-rise buildings with no sort of semi-public, semi-private space adjacent to them. And that connotes, that reads sort of poor, low income, not defended. So there's certain symbolic meanings of those building forms that have to be avoided according to Newman. And then finally, as we were saying before, try to locate those buildings in areas that don't always already have some stigma attached to them, so people are going to be biased against living there or going there in the first place. And areas of environments do acquire these symbolic meanings. For example, South Central LA, after the riots there, people riding on the freeway through that area were very reluctant to stop and have a hamburger, for example. They didn't want to have fast food there. I worked with a graduate student who did a dissertation where she photographed various areas in South Central LA and other parts of LA like Westwood, Burbank, and she put different labels on them. She took a South Central LA image or photograph and called it Westwood. People were much more positive about that environment, even though it was actually in South Central LA. So people develop these biases and these prejudices based on the history of what's happened in those environments. Now, from an environmental psychology point of view and an urban design or facilities design point of view, there are strategies we can use to enhance defensible space. So that's what I want to talk about next. What are some design strategies we can use to create a stronger sense of personal space? One of them, or a stronger sense of defensible space. One strategy is to use color and enclosure. So here you've got this recreational sort of semi-public, semi-private area attached to these buildings by virtue of the fact that you're repeating this color scheme here in this outside environment, the same color scheme that's on the front door. So it's sort of tying that space to that environment. So people that are in that space are presumed to be residents or visitors of the residence. Another thing that we want to try to do is go back to Chris Alexander's notion of intimacy gradients. He claimed in this book, A Pattern Language, that it's important to lay out buildings or neighborhoods according to a sequence that begins with the public entrance and leads into slightly more private areas and finally to the most private domain. So even in these low-income apartments, you give the residents at least a symbolic porch where anybody going from the sidewalk onto the porch is entering a kind of semi-public, semi-private zone. So it's a transition into the more private part of the apartment. And also in a work environment here, you might create this sort of social space buffer zone, semi-public, semi-private, for team interaction, where the individual can go into the private workspace, pull this door closed, and have more solitude. So you want these intimacy gradients as much as possible in various kinds of environments. Now I'm going to go to the other slides for a minute and show some examples of these strategies. So here we are back at Pruitt-Igoe before it was torn down. And you can see the lack of an intimacy gradient here. You've got the public street, and you go right into the guts of the building. You're not really defining this area as attached to the building in a meaningful way. A lot of graffiti in the interior public spaces around the elevators and the stairwells. You had play areas that were kind of minimalist. They had to cut out of those projects, the original plans, they had to cut out gardens, they had to cut out the more enhanced play areas and playgrounds, and they gave people some hoops and some areas to play racquetball, but basically the parents had a hard time keeping surveillance over where their kids were because they were so high up on the top floors. So eventually this whole thing had to be torn down. And if we go into some of the strategies that can help enhance defensible space, one of those strategies is elevation. So I'm going up the stairs now, and that doesn't necessarily take me to a more private area of this room. But in this space, as you go up the stairs, you go from the public parking lot to these different landing zones here, these different levels, and finally you get up into the private apartments. So you're making a transition as you go through this landscape. So you can use elevation, you can use landscaping to connote that you're moving from a public to a private area. You're trying to beef up those intimacy gradients. Okay? You can do that again with color. You can try to tie this public sidewalk to the residential structures by bringing those colors up on the wall here, just as they did in that other slide I showed you where they're bringing the color to match the doors, the front door colors. And here again, they're using that colored asphalt to define this outside area as attached to this residential facility, so that people who are out here are assumed to be part of that community. So it helps sort of communicate through the environment who belongs, who doesn't. And that increases more defensible space. Another strategy you can use is site planning. So in this particular instance, the designers created a kind of L-shaped block, and they created a buffer zone that was bounded by these two sides of the apartment building, so that residents could look out of their windows here on this buffer zone, which is, attached to these buildings only. And that provides the transition from the public street into the semi-public, semi-private play area here, or sitting area, and then into the apartments. So you create this kind of buffer zone for the different entries of that building. So that's using site planning. By siting the building in a geometric way, you create that greater defensible space, surveillance opportunities. And here again is that apartment building in Maryland, where they're creating these small porches, and they look very minimal, but at least they're giving the residents some inclination that they have this transition from public to private. Here in Baltimore, you have those porches again, signified by some plant decorations to give that community some social identity, that people care about that community, that there's a sense of sort of jurisdiction over that place by the families that live there. And one other strategy that's been used, and we'll talk more about this when we get into the role of nature in human behavior, but some low-income communities in New York and other large cities have run gardening programs for the residents, where they give the residents some gardening supplies, some seeds, some tools, and they have a contest at the end of the summer to see who grows the best vegetables and who wins that contest. And these programs are very helpful in sort of bringing the residents together. Sometimes gang members will get involved to protect the gardens, and there's a whole kind of synergy that happens to create more positive social climate, more defensible space. So you try to create activities near those environments that accomplish that. Okay. So just recapping the examples that I've talked about, these are some strategies that you can use as a designer to enhance defensible space. Color coding of secondary territories to attach them more clearly to primary territories. The primary territories are the apartments themselves. Site planning of buildings to create natural buffer zones that can be surveyed by the residents. Using elevation and landscaping to mark transitions between public and private areas. Establishing interaction spaces like gardens for residents adjacent to apartment buildings. So what you can do is you can capitalize on these different strategies to take an environment that might be low income, it might have some limitations to it, but through environmental design, enhance the social climate, the social properties of that environment. Now, we said that physical and social environments are highly interdependent. They influence each other in major, major ways. This is a great example. This study that was assigned for today by Don Appleyard. How many of you have read Appleyard's work before? Any of you? Well, he's a really influential urban designer who taught at the University of California, Berkeley for many years, and he unfortunately died very early in an automobile accident. But some of his signal contributions to the field were to study the effects of traffic and traffic volume on social behavior. And he did this really interesting study in San Francisco where he took the same basic neighborhood with the same racial composition and socioeconomic status, but some of the streets had 2,000 vehicles going through them per day. The moderate traffic streets had 8,000 vehicles per day, and the heavy traffic streets had 16,000 vehicles today. So you've got a lot more traffic volume in that bottom situation there. And he then asked people to draw their home territory. What did they regard as their home territory in those different environments, those different streets? And what he found is in the lightly traveled streets, people referred to their territory as the whole block. I feel that my home extends to the whole block. Street life doesn't intrude into the home. Only happiness comes in from the street. That's a pretty positive comment. I definitely think of this whole building as my home. I feel a sense of responsibility. These are some of the comments that his respondents made when he surveyed them about their neighboring behavior. Who did they neighbor with? How broad was their conception, their cognitive map of their territory? On the moderately traveled street, you had a more shrunken notion of social territory. You had people, not as many people drawing the whole block. Some were drawing the whole building. Some were drawing just their immediate apartment. And in the heavy traffic street, that's where you saw the most contrast with the lightly traveled street. So people here are saying it's impersonal and public. Noise comes from the street and intrudes into my home. My territory is just this apartment, not even that. So what happens in these neighborhoods, these streets, is that fewer kids are outside playing. It's a less walkable environment because of the pedestrian safety concerns. And you see this kind of deficit at the social level created by the higher traffic volume. So you've got the physical environment knocking down and diminishing the social interaction, the neighboring. So it looks like a pretty deterministic effect. And it might be different depending on certain contextual features of neighborhoods. But generally, high volume traffic does tend to do that to neighborhoods. It makes them less safe, it makes them less child-friendly, and less sociable. Now, when we look at pedestrian safety, I was talking about children not playing on those heavily traveled streets. When you look at these different types of transit and deaths per 100 million miles traveled, driving is associated with 1.4 deaths per 100 million miles traveled. Flying, just 0.2, so flying tends to be a lot safer than driving. But walking is associated with nearly 50 deaths per 100 million miles traveled. So pedestrians have a harder go of it in our cities, especially in some freeway-dominated cities like Houston, Miami, LA. So in the next part of the lecture, I'm going to give you a little break now. In the next part of the lecture, as we finish up, I want to go through traffic calming strategies. How do you take a neighborhood and calm down the traffic, slow it down so it's safer for pedestrians, but also make the neighborhood more walkable so that it provides more amenities for people to actually be out in the neighborhood and walking around. So take about a 5-minute break. Okay, we're back. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to see a short video by Donald Appleyard that was made using the Berkeley Environmental Simulation Laboratory, and it demonstrates how he developed some ideas about traffic calming. So it's a pretty good indication of how the research developed at Berkeley, so I'd like you to see this. And it's kind of a cross between environmental assessment research and simulation research, as well as traffic calming.
Nearly everyone lives on a street. People have always lived on streets. They are the only true public places in our cities. Here is a residential street in San Francisco, where many families with children live. It's late afternoon, after school, and the children are all out on the street. They play around between the cars, for the street is almost the only open space available. But traffic here is light. Not too many cars can drive through. In fact, it's quite a unique street. On most streets in San Francisco, the traffic has all but suppressed this kind of street life. Now, this film is going to show a few ways in which more livable streets can be created. We will do it by bringing a street into the laboratory. Here it is, a two-way street with parallel cars parked on each side. Quite dangerous because children can dart out from behind them. Now, the first thing we can do is this. We can group the parked cars. Right-angle parking stacks them more compactly and makes some room for other resident activities. A street corner plaza can be created in front of the market. The wider sidewalk along the houses can be used for individual front gardens, and residents can come out on the street. The street is narrower and one way. Parking is a little difficult. all helping to slow the cars. Another solution is diagonal parking. This makes the sidewalk wider. Children who are hidden behind other kinds of parking stand a better chance to see and be seen by passing cars. But we could make a more effective change by turning the end of a street into a cul-de-sac. The parking spaces lost are placed along the end of the street, leaving enough space for a communal garden. While reducing and narrowing the traffic space is one way of increasing resident space, sharing the street space is a new alternative. In the Netherlands, such a street is called a woonerf, W-O-O-N-E-R-F, and that means residential yard, or a garden street. Here, pedestrians have the legal right-of-way. Car drivers are allowed into the space, but only if they drive under 15 miles per hour. A curb or ramp must be passed over on entry, and the sidewalks are expanded to take in the whole street. We have accommodated the same 18 cars that were in the other alternatives. Naturally, empty parking spaces will be used by children, and they have been found to play more in the street space. These streets have become so popular in Holland that over 800 woonerven have now been constructed. In the late afternoon hours, this street could become alive with people, and yet remain a peaceful sanctuary away from the traffic. In this film, we have started to redesign the inner city street. Our next film will take a look at the future residential street, as energy conservation becomes more urgent. For example, smaller, more energy-efficient cars. Here is the first one on the block. What if everyone had one? They require about 1/4 of the space of a current American car, and the moving lanes could be much narrower, all opening up more space for resident use. Now, the redesign of streets and cars can not only protect residents and children from the negative effects of traffic, they can make the city a place where people might really like to live.
So that's a great example of using an environmental simulation lab. In that case, it's a scale model dynamic simulator that they built in the basement of Worcester Hall, which is the architecture and planning building at Berkeley, to simulate different chunks of San Francisco and Marin County for these kinds of studies, and they've used it extremely effectively. It also ties back to a theme we mentioned when we were talking about sustainability, the green roofs movement. And the whole idea of bringing nature into the city, on our roofs, on the street level. And we're going to see this theme over and over as we get into the urban design part of the course. We talk about the effects of nature on behavior and health. Now, what Appleyard was showing you there were some design strategies to slow down or calm the traffic. So these are elements like speed bumps, median strips, narrow road widths, pedestrian safety signals that reduce speed of vehicular traffic. And he talked about Holland, the Woonerfs, or street gardens. And these are some of the things that typify them. They use these kind of posts to protect the areas near the buildings for children to play in here. The streets are very narrow. The parking is such that you can't cram as many cars in there. They sometimes put a little bend in the street so you can't go as fast, and there's a lot of signage. So these are all elements that are used to try to slow down the traffic. And I want to show you some 35 millimeter slides here of strategies that have been used in other areas in Europe and the US. So this is Holland again, and they use narrow streets. They use these sort of roundabout elements to slow down traffic, and they often close off their public squares. This is Delft, Netherlands, where they've closed off this whole central area of the city for mostly pedestrian activity and festivals and fairs. So it's a very pedestrian-safe, defensible kind of environment. This is Faneuil Hall in Boston. And again, it's a very large urban area where they're using trees, they're using a lot of amenities like restaurants along here, benches where people can sit, to create a sociable space. So even though you're in the heart of Boston there, you've got a kind of protected area for pedestrians. You're making it very walkable and very low impact from traffic along the adjacent streets there, even though it's very close to the downtown commercial district. How many of you have been here? Anybody been here? Yeah. What's your name?
Susan.
Susan.
Yeah, I was just, wait, is that part of Boston, what you were just showing?
This here, though. Well, yeah, the previous one was Boston.
I was in Boston 2 weeks ago.
Oh, okay. So did you go to Faneuil Hall?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a nice area. Anyone know where this is? So this is Seattle. It's called Pioneer Square. And again, they've used the trees. They've used some protected area here for meal space. A lot of walkability in this kind of environment. And it becomes a very attractive place for tourists and for residents alike. Now, closer to home, you all have probably seen this street near UCI. Even in Irvine, there's been an investment in street trees. So you've got this planting here and these wide sidewalks that make that area a little bit safer for pedestrians, a little bit more amenable for walking. Here on Michelson, you have a kind of pedestrian device that's set up where you push the button here and basically the street lights up when the pedestrian goes through so cars can see them. So these are all strategies to slow down the traffic, make that environment a little safer and more walkable for people living in the area. Now, in Zurich, you see another European kind of convention, and that is to put a lot of emphasis on bikes, on rail transit. So they've got an incredible tram system there where you can get anywhere in the city really quickly, and you get on one of these trams and they give you a really good picture, a cognitive map of the next stop coming up, and you can cover a lot of ground, even though those are running right through the middle of the city. They go pretty fast. This is the Zurich train station, and the train system in Switzerland and Italy and Europe in general is a lot more developed than what we've got over here. And then you go through European cities like Zurich and you see this preponderance of bicycles. So people are, through their culture, they're sort of reinforced to ride bikes, to walk, and to be less dependent on automobiles than we are over here. That's another way of slowing down the traffic. Now, this term walkability of neighborhoods comes up a fair amount, and I want to sort of go into what exactly we mean by a walkable neighborhood. So this is that area in University Park with those nice trees along the sidewalk. The school is over here, University Park Elementary. And you've got this median strip that was put in at great expense to kind of slow down the traffic on Michelson Drive. Now, by walkability, we mean overall support for pedestrian travel in an area. It takes into account quality of pedestrian facilities, roadway conditions, land use patterns, community support, security, and comfort for walking. You know, do you give pedestrians benches to sit down on? Do you give them other kinds of facilities like those signals that they can push to alert people that they're crossing the street? So specific factors that enhance walkability of a neighborhood would be the presence and quality of sidewalks and crosswalks. If you give people, specific places to walk and you don't put them right up on the street, for example, and where you have lower traffic volumes and speeds, how safe do people feel when they're walking? That's an important component, a subjective component of walkability. Do you give them street trees, water elements, other natural elements that people are naturally drawn to? Connectivity between streets. A grid system like in Manhattan is very connected. All of those north, south, east, west streets are interconnected. So you can walk around that city and get your services very quickly. However, if you live in a cul-de-sac neighborhood like Woodbridge or some other area of Irvine or Newport Beach like East Bluff, you go into one of those neighborhoods and you've got these very curvy streets, and that's great for separating people from high traffic, but it doesn't make the neighborhood as walkable because you can't get to the grocery store as easily or you can't get to a restaurant as easily. So mixed-use planning and clustering land uses together in different ways in a high-density situation is more promotive of walkability than these cul-de-sac sprawl situations. Even though some people like the suburbs, they like to get away from traffic, it does cut down certain aspects of walkability. And it gives them less proximity to valued destinations. So areas that have mixed uses, you could do a lot of things in a square mile, whereas in another neighborhood, you've got to, like if you live in Turtle Rock, Irvine, you've got to drive down Turtle Rock Drive to get to the Safeway or the Cleaners or anything else. So these are some walkability dimensions. And here we're comparing a grid street structure with a sprawling suburb. And this makes the point that in this cul-de-sac in Bellevue, Washington, there are very few shops and services within walking distance. So you can get a nice contact with nature and walk around your neighborhood. But in this situation, you're going to have a lot more proximity to mixed residences and businesses. So this becomes a more walkable place. And you can go to a website online called walkscore.com and plot any neighborhood and see the walkability coefficient. So the next slide shows, actually it's one of the later slides. This shows the walkability of UC Irvine. They're saying that we have a walkability score of 77 out of a possible 100, so it's a very walkable environment from, sort of near the best range. So the campus is pretty walkable. A lot of services nearby in the marketplace you can get to quickly. But if you go into one of the residential villages or neighborhoods of Irvine, much less walkability. So you can try plotting walkability of Turtle Rock in Irvine or Northwood, and you're going to see less of that walkability. Let's go back to the earlier. So these are some more specific features of walkability that promote it. So they say, picture a walkable neighborhood. You lose weight every time you walk to the grocery store. You stumble home from last call without having to wait for a cab. You spend less money on your car, or you don't even own a car. When you shop, you support your local community economy. You talk to your neighbors, so it creates more social support, social climate. What makes a neighborhood walkable? Well, it has a center usually that draws people together. It has higher density. Lower density environments aren't as walkable generally because they don't have that mixture of land uses. So mixed income, mixed use of land tends to promote walkability. Parks and public space that bring people together for recreation. Pedestrian-centric design where you're looking out for the needs and comforts of pedestrians. And nearby schools and workplaces. These are all factors that enhance walkability. And there's a whole movement now called the Complete Street Movement, which is to make city streets complete in the sense that they serve not only motorists, but they also serve pedestrians, they serve vendors. There's a lot of things going on those streets. So they're accessible, they serve people that may have disabilities. They have these street furniture for people that need them, shade, well-connected streets, not too fast in terms of the traffic, and very comfortable in terms of protected bus shelters, crosswalk timers, bike lanes, things like that. So these are some features that enhance walkability of neighborhoods. So we're looking at how things like defensible space, walkability, pedestrian safety can enhance the social climate and the helpfulness of a neighborhood where people are going to interact more positively and more regularly and create those sort of neighborly bonds that make for a strong community. Now, environmental psychologists have gotten very precise in measuring what are features of neighborhoods that contribute to walkability. So these are some surveys that were designed by a UCI team, Mariella Alfonso, who got her PhD in PPD, Chris Day, and Marlon Bornett. And they've developed these different guidelines for different types of crosswalks. So you've got the white painted lines, you've got the color painted, the zebra striping, different road surfaces and textures. So you can rate an environment as to whether it has any of those particular amenities. Also, you can look at it in terms of pedestrian crossing signs and signals. And you can rate it as to whether it has a pedestrian activated signal like I showed you on Michelson, or underpass, overpass for pedestrians. So these are all features that make it easier for people to walk through their communities. As well, sidewalks, green belts, trails, paths. Some communities not only have the traditional street, but they have these side trails or scenic vista areas where pedestrians are drawn because of the views and the kind of sociable quality and the natural quality of those environments. So you can rate the environment. Does it have those kind of green belt amenities? Street trees are very important. You have some of these neighborhoods that look like gardens, overarching trees, where it provides a kind of canopy, very natural feel, compared to this kind of monolithic concrete in some neighborhoods. And that's what we're talking about, the Bonaventure Hotel. And I'll show you some slides of that in the next part of the course. Outdoor dining and meal spaces tend to humanize a space. And Pioneer Square, that example I showed you in Seattle, is a good example of that. In Europe, you see a lot of sidewalk cafes. To have people occupy these social spaces adjacent to the building so that they can, relax. These are called third places. And when we get into the next part of the course, we'll talk about the importance of having communities with a rich array of third places. First places are homes. Second places are workplaces and schools. But third places are these relaxed, like Pete's Coffee, a bookstore, a lounge where you can go to hang out with people, strangers or friends, and let your hair down and just kind of relax. And the best cities tend to have a lot of these interesting third places. Irvine doesn't have so many third places, actually. The nightlife here is pretty restricted after about 10 p.m., right? So if you go to a place like Laguna Beach or Westwood, you got a lot more of those third places that are active throughout all hours. Street furniture, are you providing sittable spaces for people that want to use that area, or covered shelters here in case it rains? Bike racks, things like that. So looking ahead to the next part of the course, we've gone through these different ways that people relate to their environments through cognitive mapping, personality in the environment, attitudes and assessment, sustainable behavior, human spatial behavior. We've talked about environmental stressors, how those affect us. We've talked about social interaction, the impacts of behavior settings on people developing leadership skills. So these are all representing these interpretive, operative, evaluative, and responsive ways of dealing with the environment. And obviously, they're not exclusive. People are using these different strategies all the time. And when they're able to not just react to things, but also operate on the environment, we call that optimization. They're able to try to bring the environment into line with what they want, to be more attuned to their goals and needs. When they're just stuck in the reactive mode here, they're adapting passively, but they're not able to optimize. They're not able to change the environment in a way that reflects what they want. So as we've gone through these different areas of research in environmental psychology, now the question is, can we translate them into principles of design, whether that be classrooms, workplaces, healthcare centers, urban neighborhoods? How do we take these design findings and these environmental behavioral findings and translate them into improving our environments? We call that translational science, or action research. Research in the service of action, trying to make the community better. So that's where we're going. We've kind of reviewed some of the basic findings, basic science in environmental psychology. Now we want to apply it, and that's the next part of the course. Now, before we do the midterm review, since we're talking about environmental assessment of streets today and street quality, I thought I'd play one more segment of the Pothole Patrol, and then we'll do some midterm reviewing.
12 at 6. Now, we all know that this year Halloween falls on a Friday, but the Pothole Patrol, a Wednesday tradition, simply couldn't wait.
Following your emails, the crew went to Berkshire Street today, where the tricks and treats came 2 days early.
Oh, dear.
ladies. There she blows.
Hello out there. I love children, animals, and Halloween.
It's everyone's favorite holiday, and the Pothole Patrol's bringing the noise and the hot mix to this quiet Shreveport street.
I've been going around it long enough.
How long?
Well, I don't know for sure.
Are you scared of the camera?
Well,
You're not scared of pandas, are you?
no, I'm not scared of you.
It's just me. Don't let the costumes fool you. This is Henry, and this is Trinity. We're still doing our thing.
This street needed fixing the potholes. I hardly expected this.
Michael Jackson loves animals. Yeah, we know. We just like to stay in character. Hello, sir.
Hey, Patches, how you doing, sir?
Doing all right. What do you think about this pothole crew?
Well, I think they're doing a good job. This is something I've been out here about 9 years, and it's something I think the customers will really appreciate a little more out here. Pleasing the citizens. It's my job.
Face down in the pothole, won't admit the feet, so the mix is soiled and black. He's a big, strong man with an alligator head. Don't you take his boots away. Oi!
From the Pothole Patrol to you, have a safe and happy Halloween!
All right, so let's do some questions, midterm reviews, study guides. Some of you were puzzled by questions on the study guide. Somebody asked on a message board, what's meant by the user needs gap? What's the user needs gap? Anybody remember that? What's the gap? Yeah, Haruna. Okay, so Haruna's saying it's a communication gap. The designers talk to the developers who are paying them to design an environment, and a lot of times the developers don't know what their end users are going to need, like the office workers or the students that occupy a classroom. The university administrator commissions a classroom, but they haven't necessarily done an assessment to know what the students want or what they prefer. So there's a gap. There's a communication gap between the end users and the designers and developers. So that's what we mean by that gap that has to be bridged by doing this type of research, which alerts the designers to some of the congruence issues. How do you make an environment more congruent or better fitted to what the occupants need? Other questions that came up. Somebody asked, why would a highly legible environment, in terms of Kevin Lynch's notion of environmental legibility, cognitive mapping, why might a highly legible environment not be good in all circumstances? Anybody know why that would be? This gets back to what Dr. Misra lectured on, environmental cognition. Somebody take a guess. Okay, Aruna. Okay, so there's some value in mystery and serendipity, and when everything is too grid-like and too predictable, people get bored. That's one of the raps on Irvine. It's too predictable, it's too staid, it's not interesting, it's so planned that there's no happenstance or serendipity here. So the extreme legibility is where you have boredom, but the extreme illegibility is where you have people getting lost and confused and stressed. So you want that happy medium where you don't want either extreme.
Urban imageability, can you elaborate a little bit more on...
Urban imageability?
Yeah.
Yeah. Kevin Lynch, in Image of the City, one of the paperback books for the course, talks about two key characteristics of environments based on the design. One is legibility. Can you find your way? Is it clear how to get from point A to point B? Imageability is simply, does it evoke and create strong memories? Is it easy to remember because something strikes you there that's really interesting? So it's not so much navigability, how do you get point A to B, which is legibility and coherence, but rather imageability. How strong of an image does that create in you? And how do we create, using design features, how do we create stronger imageability? So you can put a landmark near an intersection and a node, and by putting those different elements together, create more imageability. So you've got the Hancock building on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and as you come around that bend and you see that tall building and the edge of the lake, it's a very visual, imageable kind of scene, and it makes a kind of iconic image of Chicago, just like the Sydney Opera House is a highly imageable representation of the city of Sydney, Australia. So that's what we mean by imageability. Amber's saying, why are you distinguishing between urban imageability and just plain old imageability? And imageability is a more general term, but you can apply it to a city, you can apply it to a suburb. Yeah, the last walk technique in the Milgram and Jodelet study was, they were trying to come up with different ways of assessing people's cognitive maps of their neighborhoods or their cities. So one way you assess cognitive map is you ask people to draw a sketch map, and you see how accurate it is, or you see how many elements, which elements show up in that map. So they looked at Parisians' maps, and they saw that the Eiffel Tower shows up in just about every map. The river, the Seine River, shows up in just about every map. But there were certain other elements of Paris that didn't show up so much. So they wanted to come up with some other ways of measuring people's cognitive maps. So one way of doing that is to assess what areas of Paris mean the most to them. They're most sentimentally attached. Remember, we talked about place attachment, place identity. So they asked people to do the last walk technique. If this was your last day in Paris, where would you walk? What's your most favorite part of the city where you'd want to spend the day? And most people chose the Champs-Élysées, that beautiful tree-lined area, to walk. So they used it as a kind of measure of sentimental attachment to Paris, favorite parts of Paris. Cognitive mapping research really came out of some studies of rats. And what they found in those studies is that if you trained up a rat to run a maze, like an L-shaped maze, where they go from the starting point to a top left-hand compartment where they get food pellets, and then you put them in a different kind of maze where, let's say it's radial, and they have 16 different routes that they can travel, and you put those trained up rats who learn the L-shaped map, how to get food in the L-shape, and go to the northeast, and you put them in this new radial maze design, the vast preponderance of the rats choose the route going to the northeast. They don't go to the southwest, they go to the northeast. So Edward Tolman, who was a psychologist at UC Berkeley, and they've named their psychology building Tolman Hall because he was a pretty famous psychologist, he discovered that even rats had the ability to develop spatial representations of their environments to find their way around. And a lot of his experimental psychology colleagues thought that was crazy, that rats don't have mental maps. And so that term was sort of out of favor for many years. But then Kevin Lynch at MIT, who was an urban planner, came along and said, I can do research on people's cognitive maps. And he started interviewing people in Boston, New York, Philadelphia about their images of their cities and what they recall about their cities and why they're highly imageable. So Beth has put up this slide here where you've got, in the Tolman study, the rat is running from point A to point B, and then in the next maze, after they're trained up to do that, so this is the radial, so then they put them in this radial maze, and they close off the route to D because that's sort of the obvious, I'm just going to go forward. But they found that path 6 going to the northeast, point B, was the most frequently traveled route. So if you, go over which? Leverage point. Yeah, leverage point means that there are certain behaviors that exert high leverage on how much energy we use, for example. So when Beth talked about finding the high leverage efficiency behaviors, we want to find the behaviors that account for most of the energy use. Like in a household, that might be the kind of car people purchase, or it might be the kind of air conditioning and heating system they have. So we want to try to influence those behaviors, or we want to try to find decision makers who are making energy conservation decisions for their companies that affect hundreds of people. They are in a high leverage position because they're choosing products that might be Energy Star rated or not, more efficient or not. So we want to leverage our efforts at changing behavior on those behaviors or people that make the most difference.